Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time looking at all sorts of very important issues, many of which we haven't had a chance to get to. As far as starting off, we'll talk a little bit about what is happening in Greece, financial woes there, and what it means to you and your family. Then we're going to briefly just talk about the fact that we now have a lot more of Hillary Clinton's emails, but only a few. Let's face it, 3,000 sounds like a lot, except there's 55,000 pages worth that we need to go through, and it's the ones that you don't receive that tell you a great deal. Then I want to focus a little bit of time and attention on some of the Supreme Court cases that we haven't had a chance to talk about. We've mentioned them in passing, but these relate to things like the Environmental Protection Agency, the death penalty, and even the decision by the Supreme Court to put on hold the various regulations dealing with abortion in the state of Texas. And then I want to come back to some of the implications of the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage. We've covered that before, but there's some very important things that have developed in the last couple of days that are certainly worthy of your note. And then in the second hour, we're going to spend some time talking about ISIS. Chris Mitchell, who is the Middle East bureau chief for CBN News, will be with us. And this is in part because of his book, Destination Jerusalem, but also because of some of the concerns. If you go to our website right now, we see that the New York Police Department, as well as various law enforcement agencies around the country, have been notified by Homeland Security about their concern that during these 4th of July firework demonstrations, something might take place because of intelligence that they have, but also because ISIS has actually issued a fatwa, a command for various jihadists to do something during this time of Ramadan, which continues on until July 17th. So we'll be talking about that in the second hour with Chris Mitchell. But in this first hour, I do want to give many of you a chance to join the conversation. There are perhaps some of you that have wanted to say something about the Supreme Court's decisions on things like marriage, or perhaps some of the other issues we will cover. And so I will open up the phones in just a minute to give you a chance to hear some of the things that I have to say, as well as comment on the things that you hear me say as well. Let's, if we can, talk just briefly about Greece. I know that for many of us, it's a far-off country, doesn't really affect us, but if you have been looking at your stock portfolio, and whether you own stock or whether you have money in a mutual fund or whether you just are sort of looking around wondering what's happening economically, we have had a situation that in which Greece has formally now defaulted. They owed a payment of $1.7 billion. I can give it to you in euros. I think it's actually 1.6 billion euros, $1.9 billion. So I'll split the difference there. Anyway, they owed that to the International Monetary Fund. They have actually defaulted on that. And so now Greece has become the first developed country to default to the International Monetary Fund, which is an organization actually of 188 nations. And this is an attempt to keep the world economy stable. You might say, well, what does that mean to the other countries in Europe? If you go to our website, we have a very good diagram there that comes from, I believe it was Associated Press is where we got this. We give due credit to it as well. And what you will find there is a diagram that begins to show the money that Greece owes to these various countries. You might also talk about what does this mean to the various Greek citizens, and you may have been seeing pictures of the fact that the banks are shut down. Can you imagine if the banks were to shut down here in the United States, even just for more than an extra day than you were expecting, the impact that that would have? Well, the banks have been shut down for quite some time, and these capital controls will last for at least a week. So that's caused a rush on the ATM machines, and you are only limited, if you're in the Greek culture, to withdraw 60 euros, which essentially is $67. So again, just put yourself in their position. You have money in the bank, but you can't get to it. The bank is closed. And then when you try to just get enough to buy food or try to pay your rent or whatever you might be trying to do, you can only take $67 out from an ATM machine, assuming that there's any money in the ATM machine. And you can see that Greece is facing some very significant problems. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on Greece other than maybe to provide something that I don't hear in the day-to-day reports. These day-to-day reports are always talking about what happened yesterday, what happened 2 days ago, what's going to happen in the future. I want to step back for just a minute because it illustrates a larger point that we've talked about here on Point of View. And that is part of this Greek tragedy, if you will, is due to the fact that they don't have children. The current problem in Greece really was set in motion years and years ago. The national fertility rate in Greece is 1.3 children per woman. Now, demographers tell us that you need 2.1 children to replace the population. That has been the current rate in the United States, but due primarily just to immigration, filling up the difference, and now we're starting to drop below that as well. So you can see that you've got kind of a difficulty right off the bat. You're trying to run an economy where you actually could systematically and even theoretically, but not so theoretically, almost systemically, have a situation in which you have more grandparents than you have parents and more parents than you have children. And so this is a system that is already straining simply on the basis of that alone. Now, you might say, well, what about these other countries in Europe? Well, many of the others face the same problem. Germany has got a much more robust economy, but they have a fertility rate of 1.42, Italy 1.41. When you look at some countries that have actually been trying to increase their fertility rate, Russia being a good example, where they're actually encouraging couples to snuggle together and have children, they have a fertility rate of 1.6. And so you can begin to see that part of the problem has to do with you are certainly seeing a collapse, what we've called a demographic winter that has happened in so many countries in Europe, and Greece and Spain and some of those are on the leading edge because they have such low fertility rates. Then you have to add to it something else, and that is the fact that there is no money in the banks. Matter of fact, one analyst said that you would need to have in many of these countries in Europe about 4 times their current annual gross domestic product in the bank in order to address and to actually fund some of their policies. And you can see that in a sense, Greece is just the tip of the iceberg. Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Ireland oftentimes remind of, we use the acronym PIGS, P for Portugal, and then 2 I's, Italy, Ireland, G for Greece, and then S for Spain, are all countries that are facing that difficulty. And it gets us back to the fact that they're trying to fund a welfare state. And as we've pointed out on the program before, in Greece, you can retire at the age of 58. Every year, public sector workers receive 14 monthly payments, and for most of them, the workday ends at 2:30 in the afternoon. That's essentially like working 7 or 8 months out of a typical American work year, and you can see that when you have too many people receiving benefits, too few people paying into it, a welfare state, and the demographic winter that we're talking about, it's not surprising that Greece has the problem that it has. Some lessons maybe we can learn here in the United States. They're not going to reverse any of those anytime soon. And it's one of the reasons why Greece is in the news right now. When we come back, we're going to talk about what's happening in the Supreme Court. There are a lot of other decisions we've yet to talk about, and we'll do so right after this.
The Point of View Commentary. with Kerby Anderson.
The Supreme Court marriage decision announced Friday has brought rejoicing from homosexuals as well as concern from many Christians and traditionalists. The 5-4 decision could have easily been a 4-3 decision if two of the justices who should have recused themselves had done so. And though we've heard quite a bit from the majority decision written by Justice Kennedy and the other justices, it's worth hearing from 4 justices that wrote their dissent. Perhaps the only comments that most people have heard from these justices was a short video from Stephen Colbert produced to celebrate the Supreme Court's ruling and make fun of Justice Scalia. To its credit, the mainstream media did quote Justice Scalia's warning that the court's ruling was a threat to American democracy. Scalia acknowledged that his concern wasn't so much about what the law says about marriage, but who rules Americans. He said, "Today's decree says that my ruler and the ruler of 320 million Americans coast to coast is a majority of the 9 lawyers on the Supreme Court." He also felt the ruling was arrogant. The 5 justices who compose today's majority are entirely comfortable concluding that every state violated the Constitution for all of the 135 years between the 14th Amendment's ratification and Massachusetts' permitting of same-sex marriage in 2003. The other dissenting justices also had much to say. Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Samuel Alito explicitly warned that Americans with orthodox religious beliefs would be vulnerable. Alito, for example, warned that the decision will be used to vilify Americans who are unwilling to assent to the new orthodoxy. You know, even if you celebrate this decision and believe that same-sex marriage should be legal, you should be concerned with the arrogance of this decision and the plain fact that the Supreme Court has become the ruler of Americans. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join our conversation along the way, 1-800-351-1212. Talked a little bit about the Greek tragedy. We'll get back to that a little bit later in the week if we have time, but did want to spend a little bit of time focusing on the Supreme Court. And before we get to the obvious case that we'll spend some time talking about today again, the Supreme Court decision on marriage, I thought I might just talk briefly about a few of the other cases that came down that in a less busy month would be ones that we probably would spend more time talking about. The first has to do with the EPA. The Supreme Court ruled that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, actually unreasonably interpreted the Clean Air Act when it decided to set limits on all sorts of pollutants from power plants without considering the cost of industry. Now, there's some that have said, well, they did that and they just didn't do it in the right order and those kinds of things. But I'm hoping that at least this would send a signal to say that various bureaucracies, which are always right now and seem to be frequently exceeding their mandated responsibilities and really exceeding their constitutional authority, might at least take this as a slap on the hand, because frankly, that's about all it is. I think the EPA can come back and do something else, but they actually took the Clean Air Act, which was passed under Richard Nixon in the 1970s. I'm old enough to have been around when they talked about this, which was an attempt to deal with some very real issues at the time in terms of pollutants. And now, of course, there has been this ability to bend and manipulate the Clean Air Act in such a way to basically close down all sorts of power plants. And again, as many people have said, this ruling was a victory for people with tight family budgets and even for people that are interested in job creation. And of course, you've had some presidential candidates like Rick Perry saying today's ruling ends the false narrative that environmental protection can only be achieved through a one-size-fits-all federal mandates and at the expense of economic growth. He says that's a premise that has been debunked in various states like Texas, of course, where he was governor, where smart regulations have proven economic opportunity and environmental protection are not mutually exclusive. So perhaps we'll have a reasonable debate about that issue. And though the court ruled only on the Clean Air Act, one of the other ones that I might talk about in the future, in a future program, is what is happening with the Clean Water Act. Again, I remember this, and I remember the concerns about Lake Erie and other places where there was a great deal of pollution. And so there was very dire consequences if we did not do some things to clean up our water back in the 1970s. But now this new attempt by the EPA is trying to expand federal authority by saying that when the Clean Water Act gives the federal government authority over waterways, almost everybody said, well, that's like rivers. One of the reasons they would say that is if you recognize the way in which our states are drawn, oftentimes it's a river that is used as the border between two states. And you can think of all sorts of examples. You can think of even where you live right now, probably in your state, one of the borders, unless you're in maybe Kansas or something like that, most of these states have some kind of border where there's a river. And so the argument was made, and I think it's a legitimate one, in a sense because both states share that particular waterway and sort of it's no man's land, there was a need for the federal government to have some regulation. That makes sense. We understand that. But now the various people in the EPA are using the Clean Water Act to say that actually this would also be allowed to expand federal authority over agricultural ditches, streams, and even backyard puddles. And that's why a lot of people are saying, wait a minute, we're probably going to have to court case over that issue as well. So we'll see whether that plays itself out. Anyway, that's just a little bit of the EPA decision that came down. Another one that came down was the issue of the death penalty, and we've talked about that before. It was a fairly narrow decision, but it had to do with the issue of whether or not they could continue to use this particular drug that was used for executions. Now, in the midst of that, of course, you also have some of the justices say, well, we not only disagree with the use of that drug. You had Stephen Breyer, as well as at least one other individual for sure, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who were arguing in this particular case that it's time for the Supreme Court to once again look at the issue of capital punishment. And the argument made by Stephen Breyer and essentially agreed to by Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, quote, it's highly likely that the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment, which, of course, is the protection against cruel and unusual punishment. If you're familiar with that, there was a time in which the Supreme Court did strike down death penalty cases. And, of course, as I've pointed out when we've talked about this on this program before, this issue of the death penalty, interestingly enough, has been up for some debate. And the example we used just a couple of weeks ago when we talked about it on the program is Nebraska now has become the 19th state in the country to end the practice of capital punishment. The argument being that sometimes there are mistakes, and so as a result, the legislature voted to actually oppose the death penalty, to eliminate it and abolish it. The governor vetoed it, and they were able to override the veto. And I've made various arguments for that before in terms of what the scriptures have to say. Genesis 9:6 is a very good example in the Old Testament. Romans 13, 1 through 7, I should say, would be a good example in the New Testament. And really the concept which is oftentimes called the lex talionis, the life for a life. And so again, this particular case, though fairly narrow on the issue of the death penalty, I think surfaced again the possibility that sometime in the future
what might happen is the death penalty might be struck down by the right justices on the Supreme Court, and that depends in large part on who is elected the next president of the United States. Just before we take a break, I thought I would take one more issue from the Supreme Court, and that has to do with this issue of abortion. As you may have heard, the Supreme Court on Monday actually decided to hold hearings, or at least to consider whether or not the regulations in the state of Texas governing abortion clinics are constitutional. So basically, they put a stay on that particular decision that was to go into effect actually today, July 1st. The law actually had two parts. The first was that it would impose strict requirements on abortion providers. In other words, it would say that your abortion clinic needs to meet the same standards for an ambulatory surgical center, and that includes regulations concerning the buildings, the equipment, and staff. The other one required that doctors performing abortions have to have admitting privileges in a nearby hospital, because if there's a botched abortion, and there are, then that individual would have admitting privileges. Many of the parts of the law have already gone into effect in 2013, and because of that, half of the state's abortion clinics, about 41 of them, simply had to close. The concern that was raised by this, and the reason why those who are promoting abortion went to the Supreme Court, is if indeed those regulations were in effect, 10 more abortion clinics in the state of Texas would have closed. This doesn't mean that the Supreme Court ruled against it. It simply meant that the Supreme Court put a stay on the implementation of it, and then will then consider whether or not to take up the case. There was a 5-4 ruling in this particular case, and 4 of the justices voted to deny the stay. So it's pretty obvious that there isn't a lot of appreciation even for this law. Of course, a lot of it has to do with Justice Kennedy. But again, remind you of the Supreme Court. It takes 4 to take a case, 5 to win. So a lot of this, again, depends on where Justice Kennedy is. I think you might be able to find 4 liberals that will want to take the case, but the big question is whether or not you would have 5 that would actually declare these abortion clinic regulations unconstitutional, especially in light when many of those have been implemented in other states as well. So we'll see how that plays itself out, but that, I think, gives you a pretty good idea of what we're going to be up for in future Supreme Court decisions. Just before we take a break, I want to talk about one of the action items that we have for you as well. If you've been listening, and I'll talk more about this after the break, you know that there have been some that have actually suggested maybe it would be a good time to question whether or not religious organizations should still receive their tax exemption if indeed their view is contrary to the stated policy of the Supreme Court. That is the issue of marriage. And so one of the action items that we're going to be talking about here in the next hour or so, and certainly over the next couple of days, is that there is a First Amendment Defense Act, and this has been actually introduced in the Senate by Mike Lee and in the House of Representatives by Raul Labrador. And this would actually protect individuals who actually hold to the traditional view of marriage, and it would prevent any kind of prosecution of those individuals or even the removal of their tax-exempt status. So if you think that is a good piece of legislation, and we'll talk more about it after the break, you can go to our website, pointofview.net, go to the Take Action section, and alert your representative about that particular piece of legislation. We'll have more right after this.
The calendar says July. Hard to believe that means another celebration of freedom is at our doorstep, and also that we need to express a heartfelt thank you for stepping up over the past week or so and helping us finish our fiscal year with a strong push. We don't have the final numbers yet, but regardless of the exact figures, on behalf of Kerby and Penna and the team and our President Warren Kelly, thank you for demonstrating just how much you appreciate Point of View. You may remember the famous quote from Ben Franklin, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." We need to hang together more than ever in the coming days, and we can't be here without your partnership. So again, thank you. And briefly, if you did not get a chance to participate, let's just say that your gifts are always timely, and we promise to invest them well. You can still give at pointofview.net, by mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or by phone 800-347-5151. Thank you. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've talked about Greece. We've talked about a couple of the other Supreme Court decisions. Now I want to focus on this issue once again of the Supreme Court and same-sex marriage. Just a minute ago when I was talking about those abortion clinics in Texas, I may have misspoke because I was talking about the fact that half of the abortion clinics closed. There are only 41 abortion clinics. I think I left a word out. So half of the 41 closed back in 2013, in case anybody's using those numbers. And, of course, the concern was that 10 more would close if indeed the Supreme Court had not stepped in with their stay, which would have happened today, July 1st. But it did not, and we'll see where that goes. Let's, if we can, address one more issue, and that is how we're seeing that, as Jonah Goldberg says in his piece that we've posted on our website, you can't compromise with culture warriors. And he said, I love reading the If You Give a Mouse a Cookie books to my daughter. And these are somewhat like Aesop's fable, and that is the theme, that if you give the mouse what he wants, a cookie, it will want just more, a glass of milk, a straw, etc. He said the story came to mind last week, a week that began with many vowing to put down the Confederate flag and ended with the Supreme Court mandating that there is a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. I'll skip a little bit here, but he thought, you might have thought that once the gay activist, and I recognize many homosexuals just want to be left alone, but I'm talking about those activist types, once they won this victory, that would be it. Mission accomplished, as he said. But no, he said, even when the cookie is this big, the mice want something more. The call went out that there were new citadels to conquer. Within hours of the decision, Politico ran a call to arms entitled, It's Time to Legalize Polygamy, Why Group Marriage is the Next Horizon of Social Liberalism. On Sunday, Time magazine had Mark Oppenheimer's Now's the Time to End Tax Exemptions for Religious Institutions. He said earlier in the week, as corporations and politicians were racing each other to shove the Confederate flag down the memory hole, a co-host asked CNN's Don Lemon whether the Jefferson Memorial should be removed from the National Mall because the former president owned slaves. He said no, but there may come a day when we want to rethink Jefferson. He said within hours of the same-sex marriage ruling, the White House was beaming the gay pride rainbow flag on its facade. This is the White House whose current occupant campaigned in 2008 passionately insisting that his religious faith required him to oppose gay marriage. The president and his party now consider that position to be unalloyed bigotry. He said many of us always believed Barack Obama was lying about his opposition to gay marriage, a belief corroborated when his former guru David Axelrod wrote in his memoir that he advised his client to conceal his personal view for political expediency. It's something of a secular piety to bemoan political polarization in this nation, but polarization in and of itself shouldn't be a problem in a democracy. The whole point of having a democratic republic, never mind the Bill of Rights, is to give people the right to disagree. He goes on to say, the deeper and more poisonous problem is the breakdown in trust. Again and again, progressives insist that their goals are reasonable and limited. Proponents of gay marriage insisted that they merely wanted the same rights to marry as everyone else. They mocked and scorned and belittled anyone who suggested that polygamy would be the next agenda until they started winning. A 2013 headline in Slate declared, legalize polygamy, and a writer in The Economist editorialized, and now on to polygamy. The Atlantic ran a fawning piece on Diana Adams and her quest for a polyamorphous alternative to marriage. We're also told that the fight for marriage equality has nothing to do with a larger war against organized religion and religious freedom. But we now know that was a lie, too. The ACLU has reversed its position on the religious freedom laws in line with the left's scorched earth attacks on religious institutions and private businesses that won't or can't embrace the secular fatwa that everyone must celebrate love as defined by the left. He says, I very much doubt that we'll get a constitutional right for teams of people to get married, but I have every confidence that the drumbeat will grow louder. Social justice, forever ill-defined so as to maximize the power of its champions, has become not just an industry, but also a permanent psychological orientation among journalists, lawyers, educators, and other members of the new class of eternal reformers. By no means are social justice warriors always wrong, but they are untrustworthy because they aren't driven by a philosophy so much as an insatiable appetite that cannot take yes for an answer. No cookie will satisfy them. Our politics will only get uglier as those who resist this agenda realize that compromise is just another word for appeasement. Didn't think anybody ever write a column based on the book If You Give a Mouse a Cookie, but I guess that's a great illustration here. Once again, we are constantly told, no, that won't happen. No, this is a big issue. No, all we want is the right to marry. And over the last couple of days, we've seen how the agenda is much larger than that and will continue to grow as we go along. Anyway, let's take some phone calls. If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Let's start out in the state of Georgia. Thomas, what would you like to add to the conversation today?
I wasn't surprised with the decision on the justices with the gay marriage. It's something that we've seen coming. And it's like you just said, their agenda is way bigger than what they put on. But I am truly praying for this nation because I know that we were founded under God. And just like ancient Israel, the wilderness wandering, a nation that is founded under God and turns from God is going to suffer his judgment. But that being said, also, God told us throughout the Bible that things like this would come to pass. And at the same time, yes, we pray for our nation, but as Christians, our greatest job is to pray for the right leaders to get in there, but also to pray for more souls to be won over, because I believe we're living in the last days. And, our government doing the things they're doing, they're overstepping their bounds. Nothing's being done. And, I fear for this nation. I really do.
You were going to also add a verse from Leviticus?
Yes, sir. I can't remember it's mentioned twice within 2 chapters. It says that if a man lay with mankind as he lay with womankind, it is an abomination.
Okay, you're thinking about Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Sure, I know what you're talking about.
There you go. There you go.
Okay, didn't know if you had a different verse in mind, so I just thought I'd give you that opportunity. Well, Thomas, thank you for starting the conversation today. 1-800-351-1212. Jonah Goldberg raised an issue, and it's an issue that's going to come up now because of this national debate that will take place over the First Amendment Defense Act. And that is, Mike Lee, as I just pointed out, as well as another individual, have introduced what is called the First Amendment Defense Act. And it's going to be a national debate, in large part because we'll have to decide whether or not this is appropriate. And second of all, because of this article that was written by Mark Oppenheimer in Time magazine with the title, "Now's the Time to End Tax Exemption for Religious Institutions." And he points out, and certainly Mike Lee points out, so here you got a liberal and a conservative agreeing on this, that this is a possibility. Bob Jones University lost its tax-exempt status back in the 1980s because the school policy at the time were, quote, violating the fundamental national public policy, unquote. And so it doesn't really take much imagination to see that if indeed marriage between two men, marriage between two women is a fundamental right, anyone that would disagree with that could find themselves in the same situation that Bob Jones University saw themselves in the 1980s. So I know this might surprise you. I welcome the debate. One, because it has to take place. Obviously, we're going to have some debate about the First Amendment Defense Act. So that's going to create, I think, a national debate anyway. So let's have the debate. And I believe it would be positive for 2 reasons. Number one, I think it would be a great teaching moment for the nation. Those people who at least paid attention to the debate, I think would be really surprised, maybe even shocked at how many good things are done by Christians and by churches and Christian organizations every single day. We've talked about in the past that this president, when he was at Georgetown University, talked about how he wished Christians would get more involved in the issue of poverty. And so apparently he does not know, or at least will not acknowledge, how many good things are happening. And so I think it'd be great to let the world know what dedicated Christians are doing in the name of Jesus. But second of all, if indeed they're really wanting to talk about threatening the tax-exempt status of churches, well, let's open it up, because a lot of the individuals that benefit are not churches. There are all sorts of organizations like Planned Parenthood. That's certainly one that certainly would cause a lot of people to say, why do they have a tax-exempt status? Why should I, as a pro-life person, have part of my taxes higher because they don't have to pay taxes as a profit-making, quote, non-profit 501c3? I think some liberals might say, too, why should the National Rifle Association have a non-profit status? You could go all the way down there, and I think a lot of us as Christians have to say, as he used as an example, Mark Oppenheimer said,
really, the IRS caved and even awarded the Church of Scientology tax-exempt status. So I'd love to have that debate. It's one that I think actually Christians would win. And if everybody loses their tax-exempt status, guess what? I think the churches would still survive. I don't think the ACLU or Planned Parenthood would do so well, because we as Christians give because we're giving to the Lord. They're giving because they're looking for a tax status exemption. And that's very, very different. Let's take a break, though, and that's another reason to find out more about this First Amendment Defense Act. We'll talk more about that and how you can support it right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go to Joyce, listening on KJRT in Texas. Thank you for calling today.
Thank you, Kerby. I feel so depressed because the new Supreme Court ruling gives homosexuals all the power, and the heterosexuals cannot voice their opinion. They cannot say no to issuing licenses or anything else. It is not an equal judgment, I don't think.
Well, I think you got a good point. And, yesterday we had Kelly Shackelford here talk about the fact that, let's just use an example of those who were issuing licenses. And you recognize that some of these county clerks are going, I don't want to issue a same-sex marriage license because I don't consider it marriage in the first place. And
Correct.
Kelly said, what was issued by the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, in the state of Texas, and for others in other states it'll be similar, is, well, if indeed you have a religious objection, then someone else in the area could do that. You know, there would be other clerks. Well, Mark Davis, right in the Dallas Morning News, he's been making the argument that just doesn't work, he said,
Right.
because what he says is that, that might work in a place like Dallas, but imagine being out, maybe even where you live or further out in the community in the Panhandle or something like that, and they might say, well, I'm the only one here. And he argues that then the woman would just say, well, sorry, can't do that. Sorry, darling, we just can't help you. And so you're starting to see, even in, so quote, the conservative movement, a question as to whether or not you can or cannot be forced, if you're a county clerk or an employee, to actually issue a marriage license. And of course, Mark Davis's argument is that county co-workers and courthouse workers are not bakers or photographers who, but again, we're seeing that even they are being forced to do so. So there's a tyranny that's involved in all of that, and there's a little bit of an intramural debate about that, I might add as well. But it has put us in a difficult situation, and I think it's all the more reason why we need to think seriously about coming up with a solution. And that's why today we're actually asking Joyce, a lot of people, to learn a little bit more about this First Amendment Defense Act, just to defend some of the individuals that have, I think, valid religious objections to what has been rendered by the Supreme Court on Friday.
Well, I mean, even the governor signing that bill about the abortion, that they're saying that's unconstitutional. Well, I mean, what kind of an argument do we have to say, no, the same-sex marriage is not good and it's against my religion?
Well, first of all, the Supreme Court has not ruled against the Texas law. I think there's been a misunderstanding about that. They just issued a stay, and I think it's quite possible that the Texas law will go into effect. But, okay, good point. That is certainly something that we would have expected today to be implemented, and 10 more abortion clinics in the state of Texas would have closed because they couldn't meet the standards. That, I think, just brings us back to a couple of issues. Number one, we've got to ask, what do we do in terms of the presidency? Because the president is the individual that appoints Supreme Court justices. And we already can acknowledge that, yes, this majority opinion was written by an individual appointed by President Ronald Reagan. But, of course, the dissent was also written by Justice Scalia, who was also appointed by Ronald Reagan. And so who your next president is, I think, will determine the complexion of the court for a long, long time. In between times, there are some suggestions. I doubt we would impeach any of the Supreme Court justices, but we have talked about with Kelly Shackelford and others that Senator Ted Cruz has proposed that you would limit the appellate jurisdiction of the court, and that would take this case out of the court's hands in the first place. But before we even get to those questions, we do have one particular piece of legislation that is out there right now, and I wanted to educate you on this for just a couple of minutes. Senator Mike Lee, along with Representative Paul Labrador, are two individuals, Mike Lee introducing this bill into the Senate, Paul Labrador introducing it into the House. And they basically say that this First Amendment Defense Act would prevent any agency from denying a federal tax exemption, grant, contract, accreditation, license, or certification to any individual or institution for acting on their religious belief that marriage is a union between one man and one woman. All of the parade of horrors that we heard yesterday from Kelly Shackelford could take place if we don't have a piece of legislation like this. Because, as we've pointed out, we had a call from a school teacher the other day saying, as a school teacher, I'm going to have to sign something if they now say that I can't discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. That's one thing, but if I have to hold to a belief on that, I would have problems signing that particular piece of that particular regulation. Various kinds of licenses for all sorts of individuals would be affected by that. And of course, the biggest issue, which is the one that was, I think, well illustrated the other day by the editorial that appeared in Time magazine by Mark Oppenheimer. The title tells you everything. Now's the time to end tax exemption for religious institutions. Frankly, I think the churches might survive better if they ended all tax exemptions, but I don't want to try. And it doesn't seem to me that right now, if indeed this was implemented only against religious institutions that held to a traditional view of marriage, that would be very discriminatory, to put it mildly. So this is why we are encouraging you to go to our website, pointofview.net. What you will see there is in that middle column there, it says Take Action, and it's the First Amendment Defense Act. When you click on that, then it will give you some basic information about this, and as a result, we encourage you to then pass this information on to your elected representative. You might say, well, I don't know who my representatives are. Well, the good news is if you know your address, the computer knows indeed who your two senators and who your representative is. Then we have a suggested message. As one of your constituents, I ask that you please use the power of your office to protect the rights of conscience for people who believe in the traditional definition of marriage based upon their sincere convictions. I urge you to support the First Amendment Defense Act sponsored by Senator Mike Lee and Representative Raul Labrador. And religious freedom is part of the foundation of this nation and deserves to be protected. And so again, you've got this opportunity to pass this information on to your representatives, and you have two senators and you have a member of the House of Representatives. So I want to encourage you to take some action. And if you indeed are concerned about the decision that has come down on the Supreme Court on Friday, we have that particular item for you. And of course, if you would like to understand a little bit more about the impact of the decision by the Supreme Court, we have a video that Kelly Shackelford has put up there. And of course, we have lots of information. If you go to our Pray for America category there, it not only encourages you to pray for America, but there are all sorts of great resources that we have put there, lots of videos and other articles that might be of help to you. So please take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. Also, you probably by now have received an email in which we talk about this as well. But you're going to be hearing a lot more about this First Amendment Defense Act, and I think it's going to create a very good debate about whether or not we should have churches that have tax-exempt status, and we can talk about the very important things and vital ministries that are taking place by dedicated Christians doing this in the name of Jesus. So we certainly think that this is a great solution, partial solution to be sure, but at least a great solution to the decision rendered by the Supreme Court. So we encourage you to take some action. Point of View, and again, when we come back, we're going to change topics. We're going to talk about ISIS with Chris Mitchell, Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News. All that coming up right after these messages.
The calendar says July. Hard to believe that means another celebration of freedom is at our doorstep, and also that we need to express a heartfelt thank you for stepping up over the past week or so and helping us finish our fiscal year with a strong push. We don't have the final numbers yet, but regardless of the exact figures, on behalf of Kerby and Penna and the team and our President Warren Kelly, thank you for demonstrating just how much you appreciate Point of View. You may remember the famous quote from Ben Franklin, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." We need to hang together more than ever in the coming days, and we can't be here without your partnership. So again, thank you. And briefly, if you did not get a chance to participate, let's just say that your gifts are always timely, and we promise to invest them well. You can still give at pointofview.net, by mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or by phone 800-347-5151. Thank you. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Topic this hour is ISIS. We've talked about this before, but we wanted to come back to it for a couple of reasons. New book out, Destination Jerusalem by Chris Mitchell, but also, as you can see on our website here, we've posted an article about some real concerns about what might happen on the 4th of July. And this is surfaced not only in New York City, but Homeland Security has alerted lots of people in law enforcement that this could be something that could happen, especially during the time of Ramadan. So we're going to spend some time learning again about this issue of ISIS and what has happened in the Middle East and what can happen here in the United States. Chris Mitchell is the author of this new book, and you perhaps are familiar with him by watching the 700 Club and CBN. He has done reports for the 700 Club for many years and has really been on the front lines of reporting from the Middle East, really since the mid-1990s. He's an award-winning journalist who has covered all sorts of issues, not only here, but overseas. And, of course, not only is reporting to the 700 Club, but also as a regular contributor to Christian World News, which is a weekly 30-minute newscast that airs nationally in a number of different markets. A graduate of the University of New Hampshire, is also a graduate of Regent University, and an individual that certainly we like to depend on when we want to understand what is happening in the Middle East. So, Chris, thank you for joining us today.
Kerby, it's great to be with you.
And I think we have you in Jerusalem, but this is a pretty good connection given the fact that it does across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm right now, Kerby, in California. I'm doing some speaking, and so I'm a little behind you in time, but I'll be back in Jerusalem next Monday, and just taking a bit of time here to speak about the book and other things.
Well, that's good, because I was wondering, I thought, boy, this is the best connection we've ever had. We just did one the other day to Jerusalem. I said, well, how do we do that? Okay, you're in California. That makes it a lot easier. Yeah. Let's talk about the book, because, many people are familiar with Dateline Jerusalem, and that certainly talked about what was happening in the Middle East. But your argument has been that there have been profound changes in the Middle East even since the publication of that book. And so we're going to try in the next hour, if we can, to cover some of that and give people a chance to ask some questions. But in some respects, this is kind of like the addition to the previous book, because so much has happened, especially with ISIS, right?
That's right. The first book, Dateline Jerusalem, had a lot to do with what happened in the Arab Spring. Big changes down in Egypt, and we were down there in Tahrir Square when just before the Mubarak government fell. But I think this change in ISIS, actually just about a year ago, is as significant, if not more so. And that was just about a year ago. ISIS took over Mosul, and that's when they splashed on the world headlines. Then again, we were there in June. We went back there in August. And I really felt led to write the book, Destination Jerusalem, because I had the privilege and opportunity to be on the front lines with the Kurdish military, called the Peshmerga, to meet face-to-face with many of the believers. The Christians there had faced ISIS. We talked to some of the ethnic groups, like the Yazidis, who faced them as well. And I just felt it was important to help people understand who ISIS is, where they came from, and especially, more importantly, where they're heading.
Again, the book is entitled Destination Jerusalem, ISIS, Convert or Die, Christian Persecution and Preparing for the Days Ahead. A lot to cover. We have information about Chris Mitchell on our website. We also have information about the book. And let's head up to the Kurdish area, the Peshmerga, and you have talked about the fact that you were 15 minutes from ISIS. I've had somebody in studio that was a whole lot closer than that. As a matter of fact, she could actually show me on her cell phone pictures of the ISIS flag. But these fighters are really incredible individuals, and I certainly think that from a public policy or a foreign policy point of view, they are the group that we should support, and we should give them the means to actually fight and defeat ISIS.
That's exactly what they were asking for, too, Kerby. When we were on the front lines with them, they kept asking for us the kind of equipment that they needed to fight ISIS. What ISIS has done, because they took over Mosul and other places and defeated the Iraqi army fled and left behind billions of dollars worth of equipment that ISIS now has. And so the Kurdish military, as you say, they're a coherent fighting force. They're brave, they're loyal, and yet they don't have the kind of equipment. And so in Destination Jerusalem, I argue that they are the boots on the ground right now. They say they're the boots on the ground, and they really do need the kind of equipment, the military equipment, that would really help them against ISIS and take the battle to ISIS.
I might just mention that as people get a copy of the book, you've got so many pictures there, and you're actually, in many of those pictures, next to some of those fighters, and it illustrates, again, what the need might be. There are people, Chris, right now that are saying, well, I don't want to put American boots on the ground. As you just pointed out, the Peshmerga are already there, so all we have to do is provide them with the resources to defeat an army that may be one of the strongest and most militarily equipped jihadist groups ever in the history of the world, certainly one of the best financed, and one that covers as much land as, actually even larger than the land mass of Great Britain. It seems to me that we need to do something rather than sit back and just wring our hands and say, well, there's really nothing we can do because Americans don't want to put American troops on the ground.
Yeah, that's what they were saying about a year ago, that they needed that equipment, and here we are a year later. We're on the anniversary of what's called the Caliphate, and the Kurds really still don't have the equipment that they need. Part of the reason, I think, is part of the geopolitics. Baghdad doesn't want the equipment, the government of Baghdad, that is, doesn't want the equipment to go to the Kurdish military, and they want to keep that equipment for themselves, even though there has been equipment sent by the United States designated to the Kurds. That's one reason. I think another reason is that Turkey would rather not see the Kurds heavily armed as well, because they see them as an enemy. And so those two issues, those two factors, I think, are keeping that necessary equipment to really, as you said, these are the boots on the ground.
Let's, if we can, maybe answer a few questions in Chapter 3, and I'm going to keep it moving because you have so many chapters there, but you ask a good question. What possesses a young man to live and die for ISIS, for some of those goals? This is a puzzle for many of our listeners. They hear of stories of individuals, for example, in Minnesota, who then go over and fight for ISIS. Now, some have come back. I don't know that all of them, by the way, are disenchanted. I think some of them are coming back as sleeper cells, but we'll leave that as it is. Why would an individual, either in this country or even in the Middle East, join with ISIS? What is the attraction?
Well, that chapter was inspired by, we saw an ISIS fighter that was had lay dead on the ground in a place called Makmur, which is about a 45-minute drive outside the Kurdish capital of Erbil, and I saw him, and it was really moving in the sense that this life just seemed so wasted. And as you say, many are coming from whether it's in the United States or Europe or around the world to fight them. We had the opportunity just a few weeks ago to interview a father in East Jerusalem, and his son was lured away by ISIS. And part of the attraction is that they promise villas, they promise women, they promise money to many of these fighters, these prospective fighters around the world, and then they come and they get disillusioned. The father, his son, left Jerusalem without telling anybody in the family. Then they found out that he had actually gone into ISIS territory. When he found out that the promises were just an illusion, he Skyped them and told them that he was going to come back to Jerusalem. Unfortunately and tragically, he was caught at the border by ISIS. He was accused of being a Mossad spy, which he was not. And then you may remember he was executed by a 12-year-old boy who shot him in the head. And it was just a horrific video and just a tragedy, sitting down with his father with tears in his eyes, who his son has just been executed by ISIS, was really, I think, repeated over and over by these people who go there and do get disillusioned. Obviously, some do not. Some believe in this, but that's sort of the tragedy that's going on now.
We'll take a break, continue our conversation with Chris Mitchell right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
The Supreme Court marriage decision announced Friday has brought rejoicing from homosexuals as well as concern from many Christians and traditionalists. The 5-4 decision could have easily been a 4-3 decision if two of the justices who should have recused themselves had done so. And though we've heard quite a bit from the majority decision written by Justice Kennedy and the other justices, it is worth hearing from 4 justices that wrote their dissent. Perhaps the only comments that most people have heard from these justices was a short video from Stephen Colbert produced to celebrate the Supreme Court's ruling and make fun of Justice Scalia. To its credit, the mainstream media did quote Justice Scalia's warning that the court's ruling was a threat to American democracy. Scalia acknowledged that his concern wasn't so much about what the law says about marriage, but who rules Americans. He said, today's decree says that my ruler and the ruler of 320 million Americans coast to coast is a majority of the 9 lawyers on the Supreme Court. He also felt the ruling was arrogant. The 5 justices who compose today's majority are entirely comfortable concluding that every state violated the Constitution for all of the 135 years between the 14th Amendment's ratification and Massachusetts' permitting of same-sex marriage in 2003. The other dissenting justices also had much to say. Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Samuel Alito explicitly warned that Americans with orthodox religious beliefs would be vulnerable. Alito, for example, warned that the decision will be used to vilify Americans who are unwilling to assent to the new orthodoxy. You know, even if you celebrate this decision and believe that same-sex marriage should be legal, you should be concerned with the arrogance of this decision and the plain fact that the Supreme Court has become the ruler of Americans. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Great to have with us today Chris Mitchell, Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News. The new book out, Destination Jerusalem, ISIS, Convert or Die, Christian Persecution, and Preparing for the Days Ahead. I thought we might talk for just a minute about the sophistication of ISIS. We have talked with Johnny Moore a little bit about this, but you have some sections in your book about that as well, because ISIS is very proficient in using video and social media. They found ways to actually develop a social media campaign. And I've also noticed that it used to be kind of a truism that if you were going to be a jihadist, you'd have to travel to some country, Somalia, Sudan, Pakistan, somewhere, to actually become a jihadist. Now we can, in a sense, use the internet and computers to radicalize people right here in the United States. And I noticed that the FBI director recently, James Comey, talked about that. What have you found out?
Well, exactly. The sophistication, the production values of their videos, which are just barbaric and horrific, is something that we haven't seen before, whether it's the 21 Christian Coptic that were beheaded on the Libyan beach or the Jordanian pilot that was burned alive. They really have taken that kind of sadistic video to a whole new level. In terms of social media, they may be sending out as much as 100,000 tweets a day, and so they really are reaching out not only around the region, around the Middle East, but literally around the world, and it really is, as you say, it's attracting these quote-unquote lone wolves that follow, that get radicalized online. And in fact, they're asking those people, whether they're in the United States or wherever, to go ahead and attack the infidels. So you could have people in all 50 states or around Europe that could just take upon themselves to go ahead and attack. In fact, here we are in the month of Ramadan, and especially in the month of Ramadan, they're asking for those kind of attacks
Yes.
throughout the West.
Yeah, we mentioned that just a little bit before you came on, and again, that's one of the reasons we wanted to cover this as well, because of your book. And let's talk about how well financed they are, because it seems to me that they're receiving funds from human trafficking, oil revenues. When they come into a city, they clean out the banks. They even produced, and I did not know this till I read your book, an annual report, almost like a Fortune 500 company. This is not the kind of jihadist organization that we've been used to in the past.
No, the level of sophistication is really to a new level. And that Fortune 500 type annual report, it's really written in blood in many ways, because it can be extortion, it can be sex slavery that they've done with some of the Yazidis that they've captured, and as you said, oil in the banks. When they went into Mosul, I think they got almost $500 million in revenue just from that bank alone. And so they also have taxation. So they rule over, a land the size of England or more. And there's maybe 8 to 10 million people within that jurisdiction. So those people are taxed, and that's one other form of revenue that ISIS is getting.
Let me talk about what happened when we went into Mosul. This is why I think it's great to talk with a Christian commentator, because the secular ones don't talk about the fact that you've had followers of Jesus Christ in there for almost 2,000 years. This is where you have the tomb of the prophet Jonah, because this is Nineveh, and they destroyed that. And you had churches and all sorts of things that just were completely wiped out. When they went into Mosul, the impact was devastating, and I think is illustrating again almost a Holocaust against Christians in the Middle East today.
Yeah, they really do want to have a pan-Islamic empire in the Middle East, and Jews and Christians are definitely not part of that. The Christians that we talked to, Kerby, they said they were given 4 choices. First of all, they could leave their homes that they had lived in for years, maybe generations. They could stay, but they would have to pay what's called a jizya tax, an Islamic tax for non-Muslims or infidels. The third choice they had was they can convert to Islam by saying the Islamic creed, the Shahada, in front of 2 witnesses. The fourth grisly choice they had was to die by the sword. And so this is what's happening to thousands of our brothers and sisters. And that's really one of the main reasons I wanted to write Destination Jerusalem, to help people in the West understand what's happening to their brothers and sisters in the Middle East, and especially because of ISIS.
Let's see, we can talk about that goal. You mentioned it in passing, but you have a whole chapter here, The Rise of the Caliphate. And, when you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, they wanted to establish a caliphate. This is an attempt to really do so, and it goes back to about this time last year when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi basically proclaimed that there would be a new Islamic caliphate. Explain what that is and why that is so significant, and maybe why that's drawing so many Muslims to the cause of ISIS.
Yeah, it really is. A caliphate is, the root word there is caliph, meaning successor, and the caliphate is this Islamic entity or empire that is ruled by Sharia law. The last one was in 1924 that was abolished by then the president of Turkey. His name was Ataturk. So for nearly 100 years, many Muslims have had the dream of resurrecting and restoring the caliphate. Their dream is one day to have a worldwide caliphate that is ruled by Sharia law. So this is, when al-Baghdadi did that, it really inspired Muslims around the world that they could one day come to this. And the other thing that's significant, Kerby, about this is the fact that al-Baghdadi talked about the house of peace and the house of war. It's a simple concept, but what it simply means is that part of the world that is subjugated by Islam, they feel is the house of peace. That part of the world that is not subjugated to Islam is called the house of war. So it's the duty of Muslims in the house of peace to wage war against the house of war so that it would be one day subjugated to Islam. And that means, countries like Israel and especially here, the United States.
Well, and again, we've talked with Charles Dyer about this as well, this idea of the house of peace and the house of war. Not all Muslims hold to this. Matter of fact, a lot of Muslims listen to this right now and say, well, I don't hold to that, and they're not jihadists. But when you have this idea that a jihad needs to take place now, and it's armed conflict against the house of war, you can see that that is sort of the motivating and animating principle for the battle of ISIS and for the future establishment of a caliphate. They believe that ultimately when we have a nationwide and worldwide caliphate, that peace will come into the world.
Exactly. And so if you look at the world today, you can see the front lines of that war between the house of peace and the house of war, like in Nigeria with Boko Haram, in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, and Al-Qaeda themselves, and groups like Al-Nusra. So that is eventually their goal. They want to take over. It sounds outlandish. It sounds like they'll never achieve that goal, but it's something that we really need to take seriously.
One of the things we've done on our website is have a link so that people can get a copy of Destination Jerusalem, and they can get it either as a paperback or Kindle or something of that nature. But one of the other things that we have done is provide a link to your website, and I thought it might be good for just a minute to talk about that. It's destinationjerusalembook.com. Talk about some of the resources there, because those would be very helpful to many of our listeners if they wanted to learn more. I would say for our pastors and for Sunday school teachers and others, this would be just ideal if they wanted to teach about ISIS this summer, and talk about what is available when people go to that website.
Well, certainly they can find the book there, and you can find a synopsis of what the book to get an idea of what's inside. You mentioned several things. They can also find out a link to what we do. We do a program once a week called Jerusalem Dateline. That's a weekly show that CBN News produces in Jerusalem to give people a better understanding, a deeper understanding of what's happening in the Middle East on a week-to-week basis. Things change pretty rapidly there, and we just try to keep people informed and educated, and so they can understand the times, like it says in the Old Testament about the sons of Issachar who did understand the times. And you're doing that in a great way, Kerby, as well. But that's what we want to do here on either DestinationJerusalemBook.com or Jerusalem Dateline.
We have it all there on the website. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Chris Mitchell, Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News. The book is entitled Destination Jerusalem. We made it very easy for you to get a copy of it, and I think you will benefit. 12 chapters. We've covered just a few of those, but we'll try to do a better job in the second half. But we'll also take some of your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212. And let me just mention that as you go there and find out some more about this book, Destination Jerusalem, as well as the information about Chris Mitchell, we do have a take action item for you, and that has to do with the need for us to provide some protection for people of faith here in this country. As I mentioned before, Senator Mike Lee and Representative Raul Labrador from Idaho actually have introduced what's called the First Amendment Defense Act that would prevent any agency from denying a federal tax exemption or grant or contract or accreditation, license or certification to an individual or institution for acting on their religious belief that marriage is a union between one man and one woman. Because we have to recognize that even though Justice Kennedy did give some comments about the First Amendment supposedly protecting religious organizations, as we've already pointed out, I don't think that's anything more than a paper protection, and this particular bill, I believe, is something that we need to do. So, again, if you would agree with that, we have a take action item where you can click on the button that says First Amendment Defense Act, put in your name and address, and then we'll surface your two senators, your representative, and you can tell them what you think about that particular piece of legislation. We'll take a break and continue our conversation with Chris Mitchell right after this.
The calendar says July. Hard to believe that means another celebration of freedom is at our doorstep, and also that we need to express a heartfelt thank you for stepping up over the past week or so and helping us finish our fiscal year with a strong push. We don't have the final numbers yet, but regardless of the exact figures, on behalf of Kerby and Penna and the team and our President Warren Kelly, thank you for demonstrating just how much you appreciate Point of View. You may remember the famous quote from Ben Franklin, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." We need to hang together more than ever in the coming days, and we can't be here without your partnership. So again, thank you. And briefly, if you did not get a chance to participate, let's just say that your gifts are always timely, and we promise to invest them well. You can still give at pointofview.net, by mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or by phone 800-347-5151. Thank you.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us today Chris Mitchell, and he is the Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News. We have links to his website, and the book is entitled Destination Jerusalem. We have a link there as well and an opportunity for you to order it. If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Have a lot more to talk about with him, but I know you have some questions, so let's take our first question here from Georgia. Bob, you are on with Chris Mitchell.
How y'all doing?
We're doing well. What would you like to ask?
I just wanted to find out what he thinks. How real is the possibility that jihad could come here into the United States in a real way?
Okay. And, of course, if you wanted to talk about an incident that took place about 15 miles from where I'm broadcasting right now in Garland, whether you want to call that an ISIS action or not, but what about this, Chris? Because I know you have some material on the website about that as well.
Yeah, well, I would say to Bob that I think jihad is already here in the United States. You mentioned about Garland, Texas, and two ISIS-inspired gunmen came to come against that convention they had about the Mohammed cartoon contest. I think it's here. It's sort of the inside the gates, as it were. It's not just in the Middle East, in Syria and Iraq. It is too many people, I think, right now. The FBI has active investigations in all 50 states, and I think it's a very real threat. Whether or not certainly not to the degree right now, but it's sort of asymmetrical warfare. They want to use what little they have right now to leverage what's going on in the United States. For example, if there was an attack in the United States like there was in Tunisia just last week when 37 people were killed by one gunman, I mean, that sends sort of psychological and spiritual shudders throughout the whole nation. And God forbid we have anything like that.
I have an article that I would encourage many of our listeners to read, and it is basically titled ISIS and the 4th of July. And I'm not trying to overplay this, but at the same time, I'm not going to ignore what we are seeing right now, because the New York Police Department and some 18,000 law enforcement agencies around the nation have been ordered by Homeland Security to be especially vigilant and prepared for the possibility of an attack during these 4th of July celebrations. And ISIS has asked its supporters to murder the enemy this month during Ramadan. So you have that. You have all sorts of statements. And, of course, as you pointed out, Chris, just a minute ago, we can look at the terror attacks in Kuwait, in France, in Tunisia. How about just down the road here in Garland, Texas, to say that those are just isolated incidents might be true in one sense, but they're brought together, I think, in a very dramatic way, theologically and philosophically, by the ideas of jihadist ideas, which are certainly articulated by ISIS. That's right, and they do see America as the great Satan. And one other thing about the possibility that they could do, Kerby, is on the southern border. Yes. We talked about Hamas tunnels in Destination Jerusalem last year. There were more than 30 tunnels dug by Hamas inside Israel, and the design there was to come out with terrorists, with tranquilizers, with weapons to kidnap and kill Israelis and kidnap the ones, bring them back into Gaza. Now, the reason that fits into the scenario here is that the drug cartels in Mexico have many drug smuggling tunnels. Now, if ISIS and the drug cartels ever collaborate, it's possible that ISIS could use those tunnels on our southern border against Americans, whether it's San Diego or other places along the border. So that is another possible scenario that really law enforcement actually wrote about that last week, and they need to be very vigilant about that as well. Hey, Bob asked about ISIS attack in the United States. We'll talk about Israel in just a minute, but I thought we might clarify for a few people. If they go out on Facebook every once in a while, they will see the Arabic letter for N, which looks like a U with a dot in the top. But that's basically, N stands for that first letter of Nazarene. And that has been the way that ISIS has identified Christians, just as you had the Star of David used by Nazi Germany. You have this Arabic symbol for the word Nazarene, or for the letter N, used to identify Christians, and it all fits into this attempt to attack not just Jews but Christians as well, because they're seen as the enemy of this attempt to establish a worldwide caliphate.
Yeah, we talked to people that were in Mosul, and they used that letter N to identify Christian homes. And we talked to a man named Fadi, whose home was taken over by ISIS. They searched his home, and they found 2 New Testaments. One of them was a small New Testament with a camouflage cover given to him by a U.S. serviceman or woman. The other one was another small New Testament that had an American flag on the inside. When they found those New Testaments, they accused Fadi of being a missionary or a spy, and they threatened to kill him. Miraculously, he escaped. He's not sure how he did it. But when we interviewed him, he asked that he not be seen in his face because he was still on an ISIS hit list. During our interview, Kerby, he broke down and cried, and he just asked Jesus to save him because he had an 8-year-old boy, a teenage daughter, and a wife, didn't know how he could support or educate them. He gave me one of those New Testaments, and it's just a reminder of the many Christians who are identified with that letter N, who are really suffering right now. And it says, Paul said in Corinthians, if one part of the body suffer, we all suffer. And I think we literally are suffering because of what many believers are going through in the Middle East because of ISIS.
We certainly have encouraged our listeners to pray for those who are the refugees. We have collected up funds and sent them off to the Cradle Fund and other things because we believe that we do have a responsibility. But let's move on for just a minute, because in one of your chapters you talk about Saturday people, Sunday people. Let's talk about those Saturday people. ISIS wants to attack Israel. Now, they're far enough away at the moment, but what does the expansion of ISIS mean to the nation of Israel?
Well, it's getting surrounded by on all sides by enemies. And the idea behind Saturday people, Sunday people is obviously the Saturday people, the Jews who observe the Sabbath, the Sunday people, Christians that go to church on Sunday. The phenomenon that's happened in the last 70 years or so is that the Saturday people have been really exiled from most of the nations within the Middle East. There's just a handful of left from maybe almost 1 million. Now it's the Sunday people that are really under assault. And what's happening to Israel itself is that you have Hezbollah on its northern border with about 100,000 rockets. ISIS is gaining territory in the Golan Heights and on Israel's border with Syria. There was just an attack yesterday in the Sinai, ISIS-inspired attack against Egyptian officials that killed 50 or so. So you can see, actually, Israel in many ways is surrounded. There was also a pamphlet just a few days ago given to Christians inside Jerusalem and threatening to kill them during the month of Ramadan. And so it's in many ways it's not only surrounding Israel, but sometimes getting perilously close inside.
You know, when we talk about what's happening in Israel right now, your chapter, Sirens Over Jerusalem, just a reminder of what it's like to live in Israel right now.
Well, that was a chapter about what happened last summer during the war with Hamas, and there were hundreds of rockets fired by Hamas into southern Israel. There were a limited number that reached Tel Aviv and just a few that came close to Jerusalem. And I was in my office one night and heard the sirens go off. They call it the color red alarm. And saw people literally running to a bomb shelter or a hotel, anything for protection. It reminded me of what it must have been like during London during the Blitzkrieg when Nazi Germany was firing against the city of London. So yes. It's a wonderful place to live, and I should make it sound like it's too dangerous. Many tourists come there, millions each year, and have a wonderful time. So it's an amazing place to be. Being in the land of the Bible. But it's also the place where Zechariah said, all nations will come against that. So we see that evolution happening.
Yeah, well, I know only so well about that. This time last year, we were trying to build enthusiasm for a trip that we took last fall, and we were able to get enough people to come, but just barely, because nothing like those rockets landing from Hamas to change people's perspective. This time next year, we're going over again, and that time we'll also go to Greece, so we'll get into some of that a little bit later. But let's take a break. When we come back, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking with Chris Mitchell, and the book is entitled Destination Jerusalem, ISIS, Convert or Die, Christian Persecution and Preparing for the Days Ahead. We have some great material that is available to you on the website, pointofview.net, which we use to link to his website, destinationjerusalembook.com. You're going to find various posts and information. And, of course, the book itself is something you might want to get a hold of. And when we come back, do want to talk a little bit more about the threat to Israel from Iran. We are just past the deadline for that Iranian peace treaty that has yet to actually be finalized and developed, but we want to talk about that in a little bit, and also maybe a few of the other issues out of the Middle East, because we're privileged to have with us just a little bit longer Chris Mitchell, Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with him and you right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back to a few more minutes as we talk with Chris Mitchell, again, Middle East Bureau Chief for CBN News, author of the book Destination Jerusalem. And Chris, one of the things that we do from time to time is have a roundtable group of guests, and one individual that oftentimes joins with us is Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, who also served in not only the military, but also in Congress. And he, almost every time he's been here, is quoting from Sun Tzu that you quote from as well. If you know the enemy study and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. But if you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And you use that to say that we have difficulty even knowing the enemy, defining who the enemy is, and then actually include a wonderful letter that was written by Brother Rashid, who hosts a popular program called Daring Questions, because he wrote this letter to the president and did this with all due respect, but really said, you know, when you say that the Islamic State is not Islamic, it's kind of like saying the Pope's not Catholic, but okay, the Islamic State is not Islamic. There are people that are saying that with a straight face, but as individuals that have lived in the Middle East, they certainly recognize that it is Islamic. What have you found?
Well, and we quote two people, not only Brother Rashid, but another lady named Noni Darwish, and these are two people that have grown up in the Middle East. They understand Islam. They were both Muslims at one time, and they know the enemy. And that was that speech in September of 2014, right after ISIS had taken over a lot of territory, and the president said that they were un-Islamic or not Islamic. And Brother Rashid goes into point by point that ISIS follows not only the Quran to the letter, but they also follow the life and teachings of Muhammad. And so it's very important, and it sort of muddies the water when statements are made like this, that we understand who our enemy is and what goals they have.
Well, again, we've had Noni Darwish on as well, but I thought just before we run out of time, I wanted to maybe have you address how we prepare for the days ahead, because that's certainly one aspect of your book as well. It's part of the subtitle. You talk about watch and pray and develop intimacy with the Lord, hide the word in your heart, look up. Talk about what our attitude should be in light of all this very disturbing news on the horizon.
Yeah, well, the third reason I wrote the book, not only to tell people about who ISIS is, but also about our brothers and sisters in the Middle East. And the third reason was to help people prepare for the days ahead. They are very dangerous right now. I suspect they will get even more dangerous. And I compare these days that we're living in to two authors who described it. Charles Dickens said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The prophet Isaiah said, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. In deep darkness the peoples." And I think we're going to see an increasing age of light and darkness. To be forearmed and forewarned, I think, is very important. That's part of the reason for writing the book, for helping people understand the times that we live in. I'll give you one example. When we understand why ISIS sends out these videos, it's to make us afraid, and they want to just instill fear. That's part of the Quran that says, strike terror into the hearts of the unbelievers. If we know what their strategies are, that we can be prepared for them. And then, as you said, the other ideas are to watch and pray, to draw close to the Lord, to draw close to our family members and our families as well. And I think those are the things that we can do to help prepare us for the days ahead. And I also wanted to add, Kerby, you know, there are good things coming out of the Middle East.
Yes.
There's many Muslims coming to faith like never before in the 1400-year history of Islam. Many of those are through dreams and visions. I've had the opportunity to meet a number of them, and it's inspiring to see what the Holy Spirit is doing.
It certainly is. Joel Rosenberg's been on this program to talk about that a little bit as well. But as we talk about certainly watching and praying and focusing, let me add one more. I mean, we do talk about political issues here on Point of View, and it does seem to me that right now would be a very good time for our listeners to evaluate some of these candidates who are going to be asking for your support. And these could be candidates to the presidency or to the Senate or to the House of Representatives or even in your state houses. But especially when we talk about whether it's this treaty with Iran, which I think is a wrong-headed idea, whether it's talking about whether or not the next president will support the nation of Israel, unlike what I think the last two presidents have been maybe a little less enthusiastic about, where they stand on some of these very important foreign policy issues and what they suggest as the possible solution to the rise of ISIS, I think are really important questions we should be asking right now. Don't you think, Chris?
I agree. I think they're of paramount importance, and I think that one first thing would be, whether or not they support the state of Israel, and will they stand behind them? How they react to the nation of Iran and its nuclear program, and what they think should be done about that, and certainly about ISIS, and do they recognize their enemy? And I think those things, those criteria, may be much more important than some of the other economic or the issues in campaign that are typically economic and more domestic. I think foreign policy is going to be paramount in this coming election because we do face an enemy, an existential threat, not only to Israel, but to ourselves as well. And, one thing I talked about in the book, Kerby, is about the dangers that the nation of Britain faced back in Nazi Germany.
Very
I
true.
quoted from Winston Churchill, and he said, "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and the Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour." And I think this really can be our finest hour, even with the dangers and the threats. I think the church can arise, that America can arise against what is the dangers of our generation.
What a positive way to end the program today. And let me just mention again, we have a link to destinationjerusalembook.com. The book is entitled Destination Jerusalem, and it's about 200 pages. And Chris, I appreciate you giving us some time in the busy schedule that you have today, and thank you for joining us on Point of View.
It's great to be with you, Kerby, and I appreciate what you do to help people keep informed and educated about all these issues of the day. It's invaluable.
Well, thank you very much. We wish you well on your tour here in the United States, and then safe travels back to the Middle East, and we'll continue to follow him. And so, again, wanted to give you that opportunity to hear from Chris Mitchell, the book, again, Destination Jerusalem. One last time, let me just mention that one of the things that have surfaced over the last week, and the question that is certainly being asked is, well, is there anything we can do in light of the Supreme Court decision on the issue of marriage? And of course, we've given you quite a bit of suggestions on what you can do. For example, get an audit and make sure that your church has done what it can to make sure that it defines the fact are used. And that's going to be very helpful if there is ever a lawsuit, and we hope that it would never happen to your church. But if it did, that's one protection. But another one that has come down the pike, and one that I think, again, you need to know more about, Senator Mike Lee as well as Representative Raul Labrador are the two individuals that have actually introduced the First Amendment Defense Act. Mike Lee, of course, has introduced it into the Senate. Raul Labrador has introduced it into the House. And we wanted to give you an opportunity to express to your elected officials your support or maybe even questions about this. And so if you go to our website right now, pointofview.net, and click the Take Action button, there is an opportunity then for you to actually express your opinion on this. And this is a particular piece of legislation that would prevent any agency from denying a federal tax exemption, grant, contract, accreditation, license, or certification, I should say, to an individual or institution for acting on their religious belief that marriage is a union between one man and one woman. So again, just wanted to give you that opportunity to express your opinion. And if you simply write your name and address into that section there, it will surface your senator and your senators and your representative and give you a chance then to express your opinion on that. And I think it is an important next step on this issue of marriage and how the Supreme Court has essentially redefined it. Let's simply say goodbye for today. We have certainly more to talk about tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris, and Abby for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
The calendar says July. Hard to believe that means another celebration of freedom is at our doorstep, and also that we need to express a heartfelt thank you for stepping up over the past week or so and helping us finish our fiscal year with a strong push. We don't have the final numbers yet, but regardless of the exact figures, on behalf of Kerby and Penna and the team and our President Warren Kelly, thank you for demonstrating just how much you appreciate Point of View. You may remember the famous quote from Ben Franklin, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." We need to hang together more than ever in the coming days, and we can't be here without your partnership. So again, thank you. And briefly, if you did not get a chance to participate, let's just say that your gifts are always timely, and we promise to invest them well. You can still give at pointofview.net, by mail, Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or by phone 800-347-5151. Thank you. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.